Hey everyone, you're watching a battle played with the game Medieval 2 Total War, and this is specifically the Britannia campaign in the Medieval 2 Total War Kingdoms expansion. And I'm playing this battle as a sort of loose tribute or inspiration based on the historical battle, the Battle of Bosworth Field, which was fought between Henry Tudor and King Richard, and they were fighting over the English throne at the very end of the War of the Roses, which was a several decades long conflict during the 15th century between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. King Richard was of the House of York and Henry Tudor was of Lancaster. Anyway, so the reason I decided to make this battle was just because in February 2010 historians announced that they had actually found what they think is the actual location of the Battle of Bosworth Field, which is slightly different from what people had thought it was for a really long time. And so I thought that was kind of a nifty bit of news, and so I was just inspired to make this. This battle is kind of funny to recreate just because tactically it's not that interesting. As some of you may know, during the medieval era of warfare, there wasn't a lot of great tactical maneuvering and strategy necessarily on the battlefield. They were often just like really bloody melees. However, this battle, the Battle of Bosworth Field, is kind of interesting in the sense that it was decided not so much by tactics as it was by political backstabbing. You see here, this is the forces I've chosen to represent the Stanleys, who were a family with a very large army that was technically on Richard's side at the start of this battle, but they had actually already agreed with Henry Tudor that they would join his side at this battle. So that's a bit of fun betrayal in store for Richard, which will come into play at Bosworth Field. Anyway, Richard kind of suspected the Stanleys were maybe not so loyal necessarily, but he couldn't really do without all their troops, so he kind of had no choice except to go forward with them. So Richard's army was technically at least twice as large, probably, as Henry Tudor's army. But then, like I said already, a good part of Richard's army consisted of the forces of the Stanleys, and they are not going to stay on his side. So anyway, the battle kind of opens up when Richard sends forth his main sort of vanguard force of men-at-arms and footmen, who are all armed with a lot are pretty heavily armored, and a lot carry billhooks, halberds, really long weapons with all manner of cutting devices on the end. And they were met by Henry Tudor's forces, who were primarily commanded by the Earl of Oxford. And the Earl of Oxford was actually probably one of the better commanders on the field during the Battle of Bosworth Field, so Henry Tudor kind of just let him take command of the army. Okay, here you actually see Richard sending in some of his knights to charge Henry's bodyguard unit. And I intentionally put Henry's bodyguard unit out by themselves a bit, along with some supporting men-at-arms on foot, just to lure Richard's knights out there, because historically Richard, at one point in the battle, he saw Henry Tudor off by himself with just a small group of his bodyguards and some of his footmen, and Richard decided, you know, I can end this battle right here by taking out this pretender to the throne. So he launched a huge cavalry charge with maybe 1,000 of his knights, which is considered maybe one of the last great medieval charges. And he smashed into, and actually here you see, this is kind of amusing, so my pseudo Richard in this battle actually did launch his own bodyguard into fray as well, along with his knights. So that worked out pretty well. Anyway, historically, Richard fought pretty well in this. He actually came supposedly pretty close to cutting down Henry himself. He cut down Henry's standard bearer, but at the last moment, Henry's men were able to close in around their leader and prevent Richard from reaching him. During the main infantry battle, the Earl of Oxford was actually successful eventually in sort of pushing back Richard's forces, which you aren't really seeing here. Okay, and now here come the Stanleys. Remember when I said they were technically on Richard's side? Well, they actually, at this crucial moment, chose to backstab him, and they sent one force of a lot of their knights crashing into Richard just as Richard was trying to kill Henry's small force. And the Stanleys would have charged into battle shouting, a Stanley, which is basically the name of their lord. And Richard would have been shouting something pretty different, probably something like treason. Anyway, so my pseudo Richard just died in this battle. I guess historically, when the Stanleys came to Henry's aid, they were able to help drive Richard. They scattered Richard's forces and drove Richard himself back into this marsh, where they eventually killed his horse, and then Richard fought on for a while on foot before he was brought down by a swarm of Welsh men-at-arms and footmen armed with halberds. Shakespeare had Richard saying, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," which implies Richard wanted to run away, but that's historically not true. Richard basically fought on until the end and refused to run. Anyway, this basically ended the War of the Roses, and Henry Tudor went on to start the Tudor dynasty in England. So hope you enjoyed this battle.